Good morning, Ove Kaj. Thank you very much for joining us here at the UNIKE 2016 conference on university futures. Thank you very much for your ideas at the keynote speech at this conference. We're all very happy to hear them. Ove Kaj is, of course, a professor of business and politics at the Copenhagen Business School. So I would like to ask what you see as the key trends in higher education today, and what do you think the relationships are with one of the concepts that you've developed in your work, which is the competition state?
Sure. There are several trends, but the principal ones is actually the way we look upon higher education. Today we look upon higher education as a set of institutions used to create comparative advantages in a globalizing economy. That is, how can we use higher education to establish a high level of competences in our labor force? How can we use higher education to produce the necessary knowledge for our politicians and decision makers? How can we use higher education to man highly professionalized welfare institutions, but also political institutions? And finally, how can we use knowledge to create national strategies for reforming our political, our welfare and other institutions? All is based on the concept of comparative advantages, and that concept is based on that from state to state, from national model to national model, we are competing with other states, we are competing with other national models to create what we believe to be our national comparative advantage. And in that sense, the vision of higher education, the way we look upon higher education, is very much different from how we did so in the 60s and 70s and up to the mid of the 80s. So there is a new role for higher education. There are new visions for higher education, leading to new reforms and managerial strategies around higher education.
This idea of comparative advantage perhaps is challenged by the trend in universities to internationalize and work with their peers across nations or in different countries. Do you think that there's a contradiction in the idea of the competition state and this cooperation and collaboration?
No, absolutely not. I was privileged to be asked by Copenhagen Business School 12 years back in time to establish an international research center based on comparative research into business and politics. And the whole idea of that department, later to become a department, was to invite international scholars to Denmark, but also to create transnational and international research projects. But the basic idea of that particular kind of internationalization was to ameliorate, to enhance the standard of Danish higher education and Danish research. So that internationalization was actually based on a concept of comparative advantage. How can we become better in competition with the British universities, the German universities, and mainly the American universities? By creating alliances, by inviting American, British, and German scholars to Denmark, and in Denmark to work in collaboration with Danish scholars. So there are certainly no contradiction, because that's the strategy of internationalization, at least in the Nordic countries, were believed to be a necessity for enhancing comparative advantages for the national higher education systems and research systems.
I think there's a pushback against this idea of ever more competition, not just in the state, but as part of the direction of the state in universities. Do you see any sources of this pushback or opposition to the idea of more competition?
Yeah, but you have to make a clear difference between how states and publicly funded research are framed within the concept of comparative advantage, and how scholars and people are reacting to that framework of competition. Because when being a professor, I collaborate with great number of other professors around the world, and I don't see the primary aspect of my collaboration as based on competition. But my government and the funds that are funding my research certainly look upon the collaboration I do have, the networks I'm integrated in, as part of enhancing their national competitiveness and so on and so on. So it's a particular aspect to the concept of competition state, that it is states and bureaucracies that are framing the research and framing the creation of scholarly networks. But within the networks, there are only a secondary element of competition. So there are two levels of competition: how the funders are looking upon what you're doing, and how you yourself looking upon what you are doing. And of course, there are conflicts among how publicly funded research are looked upon by politicians and funders, and how scholars are looking upon the research money they are receiving. And there will always be conflict, and there should be conflict, because politicians do have an incentive to control, to define, and to conclude, and scholars do have an incentive to do the very opposite. So there are constant and systematic conflicts at that level, and that's the way it should be.
To speak of the Danish case, we have recently had in Denmark a series of very large cuts to university budgets. And maybe this speaks to a wider phenomenon in higher education. Many systems and many universities present themselves as systems and institutions in crisis. What do you think are the key challenges, perhaps apart from finance, and what are the possibilities for overcoming those challenges?
The first key challenge is the belief in major cuts for universities. If you compare the kind of cuts now put through the universities to what kind of cuts have been put to hospitals, to welfare institutions in general within the last 10 years, universities are still in a very, very, very good position. Universities have not been cut to the same extent as comparable welfare institutions, at least in Denmark. This is a new thing, so to speak, that universities and higher education is put at the same level as hospitals and primary and secondary schooling and all the other welfare institutions. But certainly this put a second set of challenges on universities, that is to manage their internal organization in a much more efficient way, to spend their resources in a much more efficient way. And that it will be a challenge for every single scholar and every individual teacher within the university, because there will be more demands put on the shoulder of each of us. Similar to the demands put on the shoulder of teachers within primary and secondary schooling, with doctors and nurses in hospitals and so on and so forth. So this, of course, also changes the role or the definition of being a professional scholar. Because now, as a professional scholar, you have to include in your everyday thinking the efficiency of your work compared to the quality and the standard of your work. You have to make some kind of a reasonable reflection upon how much efficiency will challenge how much standard and quality, how much quality will challenge the efficiency. And that's a new thing for professors and associate professors and scholars within Danish university system. But it's absolutely not a new thing for teachers in primary and secondary. It's absolutely not a new thing for doctors and nurses.
My final question at this conference on university futures is, are you optimistic for the future of universities?
Absolutely. Mainly because universities are very central institutions in every single society. They are the most they can only be compared to churches and religion. They have the same long history, and they have the same cultural and historical precision in every single country. And institutions like that can never really be dismantled. They can be transformed piecemeal, step by step, but they can never be dismantled. And secondly, universities, at least in the Nordic countries, are very familiar with and very flexible towards constant reforming, constant transformation. You know, the Nordic university systems were mainly built in the 1960s and 1970s, and the whole build-up process took at least 20 to 25 years, constant building up, constant reforming, constant remanaging, constant everything. And now, just before the end of that building up period, a new period of transformation set in. And I have been a professor or a university scholar for now 35 to 40 years. I don't remember a single spring or autumn where we have not been forced to or asked to or taken on as our own initiative to transform or reform ourselves. Even if Danish and Nordic universities do have a very long historical very long history, they have been under constant transformation and reforming at least since the Second World War. So this is the flexibility or the capacity to change is built into the institution.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure speaking with you.
Nice.